And in some cases, you can argue that what they're engaged in is plots for terrorism. In other cases, the United States has intervened in another country's affairs and has conducted operations that have actually strengthened the very forces the US claims to be trying to kill.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. In order to show the complete talk of investigative reporter Jeremy Scahill at Yale College, I'll just speak briefly. Scahill reports for The Nation magazine and Democracy Now! He's written the book Blackwater and Dirty Wars and was featured in a film of Dirty Wars. He was at Yale after winning a prestigious Windham-Campbell fellowship.
And I was saying on the way over that I'm a college dropout. I was a terrible student. It's a little bit surreal that I'm sitting in the master's house here at Yale. Both my parents were nurses, and my guidance counselor in high school told me that I should think about going into plumbing or being an electrician, and which I would have made more money minus the huge check that Yale just gave me had I been an electrician or a plumber, because you don't make a lot of money working for The Nation and Democracy Now! But when Michael Kelleher, who sort of is running the Windham-Campbell Prize, got in touch with me, I thought it was maybe like a hoax or something. He had sent me a message on Facebook at like 12:45 a.m. And this wonderfully nice student here at Yale had been emailing me for like weeks, asking me if I would come up to give a talk here. And it was like I was in the final stages of finishing this huge the Dirty Wars project, and I hadn't responded to the kid, and I felt like a real asshole. And so I get this message from someone with a fancy title, like from the Beinecke Rare Books Collection at Yale. I'm imagining like somehow this 90-year-old professor in a smoker's jacket with a pipe sitting in front of a fire on the Yale campus is typing this away on his iPhone. And I get this thing saying he urgently needs to talk to me. So I wrote him right back, and there was an apologetic tone to it because I just assumed it was like this kid had gone then to like his advisor or professor and said, "Can you please email this asshole who won't respond to me?" So I wrote him back and I said, okay, yeah, you can call me in the morning and here's my cell phone number. And he writes right back and says, "Can I call you right now?" I'm thinking, all right, which friend of mine is messing with me? So I said, sure. He calls me and he says some Donald Windham. I'd never heard of Donald Windham, Sandy Campbell, didn't know who they were, Beinecke. I thought he was talking about Bernanke, and then and then I hear $150,000, and I said, what, shut up. I literally said that to him. So then I'm like imagining that I've just said to a stiff old professor with a pipe sitting in front of a fire at Yale, and I'm like, this is a great start. They're gonna tear this check up even before they give it to me. But it's been like an incredible honor to be here. I didn't spend much time at all in the academic world, and I'm so blown away by the other 8 people that have won this prize. Last night we each read 10 minutes of our work, and it was so incredibly intense and diverse and just amazing to, particularly to hear from the people who were playwrights, the drama folks. I mean, just beautiful, amazing human beings. And none of us are particularly famous people at all. I mean, I was joking last night, but I was also sort of serious. I was like, I really hadn't heard of any of you people, and I'm sure you've never heard of me before we all ended up in this sort of weird geek X-Men episode together, where there's the 9 of us as individuals, but together we're fists. No. But it's been so so cool, and I think that that when I finally then researched the biography of Donald Windham and Sandy Campbell, really fascinating guys. Donald Windham was a novelist and was a great friend of Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams. He co-wrote a play with Tennessee Williams, and he was this kid that came from nothing, and he lived in the south of the U.S. and he traveled to New York City in the 40s because he wanted to be part of this sort of growing gay literary scene, and he became a real sort of fixture and presence on that scene. And then his life partner Sandy Campbell was a smaller scale Broadway actor, and they were both major collectors of literature, and their collection is housed primarily here at the Beinecke. But in creating this this prize, one of the things that they said in it is that they wanted special consideration given to people who had no academic affiliation. And I think in a way they try to create a sort of subversive juxtaposition to have that kind of an award given to people. They don't want to give it to like big famous people, but to house it at one of the most prestigious universities, in the country, arguably the world. I think there was a message there, and I think it's one that has, I think in the current context where the idea of going to college as just the thing you have to do after high school is being somewhat called into question. Is it an arcane sort of expectation that we're placing on young people? I don't have the answer to it, but I think it's an interesting debate about whether we should have apprenticeships and trades. I mean, I wasn't ready to go to college when I was 18 years old at all. I would love to go to college right now because I think I would get a lot out of it, but I was, my head wasn't screwed on enough to be paying any attention to anything, and it would have been a total waste of money to put me in debt for the rest of my life. So maybe for the rest of my life, except for this prize. So, you didn't bring me here to tell stories laced with vulgarity about what I said to non-existent stiff professors at Yale smoking pipes in front of fires.
They do exist.
I'm sure they do. Oh, I'm sure they do. I was very disappointed that I only got one invitation to go to a secret society. I was unable to do it, but I think it would have been an interesting expose. But I was afraid I was going to be stuck in a coffin and have to tell the most embarrassing thing about my life. And sorry if any of you in the room are part of these things, because I clearly don't know anything about them. So anyway, so I said I was a college dropout. I had never really taken a journalism class in my life. I had dropped out of school. I grew up in Wisconsin. And I moved out to the Community for Creative Nonviolence in Washington, D.C., which at the time was the nation's largest homeless shelter. And I did some time there, and I did some time at Jonah House in Baltimore, which was this community run by the late Philip Berrigan, who was this famous anti-Vietnam War activist, and his wife, another anti-Vietnam War activist named Liz McAllister. And I started listening to a lot of talk radio when I was at these places. And I remember hearing this woman on the radio who was reading news from around the world and interviewing people with such incredible perspective about rebels in the Congo fighting to overthrow the regime of Mobutu Sese Seko, and the economic sanctions on Iraq and how they were actually a form of warfare that didn't necessarily even require bombs or weapons to be used, that economic policy could also be used as a weapon, and social justice struggles within the United States, and extensive coverage of at the time what they called the Republican Revolution, where the contract on America. She had done this amazing confrontation with Newt Gingrich, who at the time was the Speaker of the House, because of the revelation that his mother provided that he had called First Lady Hillary Clinton a bitch. And Amy had done this aggressive questioning of him and asking him when he's going to apologize to American women for calling the First Lady a bitch. And I just like, this is such an amazing, tenacious person. And I wanted to do anything to be a part of what she was doing. So I didn't have a computer, I didn't have an email account and everything, so I started to write her letters, like just handwritten letters. Asking her can I do anything with you? If I walk your dog, if you have one, or feed your cat, or wash your windows, or, I just want to be a part of it. I'll get you coffee. And I writing her letters never responded. Then I moved to New York, and I went to an event where this woman, Amy Goodman, was, and I came up to her, and as she tells it, I came up and started in the middle of a sentence, like I didn't even introduce myself. I was like a complete weirdo. And I kept going to things and just begging her to let me volunteer, and I really do think at one point she had to decide if I was actually like a threat, because I was basically stalking her, not in a romantic way, but I was stalking her, not in a creepy way, but it was stalking nonetheless. And she had to decide whether to let me come in and volunteer or to get a restraining order against me. So luckily she let me come in and volunteer on this radio show, and I learned journalism studying under Amy as an apprentice basically, and learned the trade of journalism. And first I learned how to do technical editing on old reel-to-reel tapes, where you would actually cut the tape and tape it together, and it was sort of an amazing hands-on. There was something that felt more working class about it, and sort of gritty. Your hands should be, get dirty when you're doing this work because you should be in the field as a journalist. And so often now the culture in Washington is everybody's literally phoning it in or texting it in. There's not that many people willing to go out into the world anymore. We spend so much time on our devices, and we can just chat someone on GChat to get a comment from them. And if you go and meet face to face with someone, you're going to get more out of it. There's going to be color to your piece, and you know, that's so working with Amy, she's very much a person whose nails are always dirty because she's in the field, and I loved learning how to edit on those reel-to-reel tapes, and I did everything possible that she would ask me to do. And one of my first gigs there, they couldn't afford to pay me at Pacifica, so Amy was actually paying me a little bit of money a day. I think it was $20 or $40 out of her own pocket to write her news headlines in the morning. So I'd get up, I would go to this newsstand near Times Square that had newspapers from all over the world. This is before the internet was the internet. You guys do not know how good you have it in terms of accessing all this information. So I would buy like all of these newspapers at like 4:30 in the morning, and I would go into the smokers lounge at this radio station, WBA. I was a chain smoker at the time. And I would read all of these newspapers and then write a 7 to 10 minute news summary every day, and I loved it. That still to this day is one of my most favorite jobs I ever had. And I got this incredible education from reading these papers from all over the world every single day. That was my main job, and I would read them for hours, and then I had to distill them into the 7 to 10 minutes worth of the most important things happening in the world. And some of what it was reading like the New York Times to take the news from it, but then to erase their bad politics out of it and then rewrite it so that we could get the thing, and then insert someone else's comment from a human rights group that is actually contrary to whatever Joseph Lieberman was saying at the time, and then it was... So I was doing that, and I was learning how to edit and getting very proficient, and out of nowhere one day, Amy says to me that she's going to go to Nigeria to report on the role of multinational oil corporations in the oil-rich Niger Delta region. And she asked if I wanted to go along. And she said, but the deal is you have to quit smoking. 10 years later, I finally did quit smoking, but she let me go nonetheless. And we went on this trip, and we did an expose about how the Chevron Oil Corporation had worked with the Nigerian military junta and provided a notorious paramilitary unit of the Nigerian dictatorship's forces with Chevron helicopters that were used then to attack a barge that had been taken over by local villagers in a nonviolent protest. And we were able to prove during that investigation that because we had Chevron's head of operations in Nigeria admit it to us on tape, that Chevron's head of security actually rode with this unit when they went and opened fire on these protesters. And we did a documentary about that called Drilling and Killing Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship. And following that, I went into Iraq with a humanitarian delegation from a group called Voices in the Wilderness. And they were bringing medical supplies and other items that were on what was called the dual use list. There was a list of items that the United States and Britain primarily, though it was called the United Nations, but it was primarily a US and British policy. The Iraqis were not allowed to import certain items if they had a dual use as a military item. And some of them made sense, but some of them were ridiculous, like number 2 lead pencils were banned from being imported by Iraq, bleach, all sorts of basic analgesics, equipment to run X-ray machines or to do chemotherapy, and so these groups were going in, and they were symbolically breaking the sanctions by traveling to Iraq with relatively small shipments of those supplies. And by some odd twist of fate, when the Iraqi foreign ministry put the visa in my passport, they gave me a multi-year, multi-entry visa at a time when journalists were bribing Saddam's regime to the tune of $5,000 to $10,000 for a 7-day visit for one journalist. In fact, I did an article on the eve of the shock and awe campaign about how I thought that I had calculated that Rupert Murdoch's media companies were probably the second greatest a source of income for Saddam's regime, second to oil smuggling, because they had so many journalists there, and I knew that they had to be paying at least $5,000 to $10,000 a pop per week per person, and they had Sky News, Fox News, all these newspapers. So I calculated it out too. I was well into the millions that they were giving Saddam to be there to celebrate his downfall, but they had paid all this money. So because I had this visa, I started going to Iraq a lot. And after 9/11, I pretty much just, I covered the war in Yugoslavia. I was living in Belgrade at the time. And I started focusing all of my attention on Iraq. I was not at that point really an investigative journalist. I wasn't covering the US military. I knew very little about the US military or the CIA, to be honest. Much of what I was doing and how I saw my role as a journalist was as someone who is going to go to the other side of the barrel of the gun that's pointed, that is US foreign policy, and be with the people that are facing it down and try to tell their stories. And so I spent time in all these dictatorships, and of course I thought Saddam Hussein was a ruthless, brutal gangster and thug, and a war criminal, no question about that, just as Slobodan Milosevic was. But I often would think of what the great Trappist monk Thomas Merton said when he was asked during the Vietnam War, whose side are you on? Are you on Ho Chi Minh's side, or are you on the U.S. side? And his answer to that was a simple one. He said, "I'm on the side of the people that are being burned." And I often think about that when I'm in those places, because I think that we have a media culture in our country that does a disservice to our democratic process, because policies are often debated exclusively through the lens of American exceptionalism, and what's left out of the discussion is the human stories of the people on the other side. When you can dehumanize people and they become the enemy, or you kill someone in a drone strike and you posthumously declare, even though you don't know their identity, that they were a militant, you're making it much easier to sanitize war. And so I think it's the role of journalists in a democratic society to give voice to the voiceless, to hold those in power accountable, and to provide the public with information that they can use to make informed decisions. I also think the notion of objective journalism is entirely made up bullshit. The New York Times certainly has agendas all over the place. They can be activist media, but it's often only people that have sort of an agenda more advocating for human rights or looking at the alternatives to war in those situations are called the activists. But huge establishment corporate media outlets certainly have an agenda. MSNBC today basically looks like an Obama for America meetup. And Fox News is, well, basically a parody of itself, where the scary, black Marxist Manchurian candidate is trying to, resurrect the Mau Mau movement in the service of communism, and Reverend Wright is going to be the Secretary of Defense. And that's basically what you get on Fox News. And then CNN is just sort of milquetoast in the middle. So you have to have journalists that are willing to embed with civilians. And so that was a lot of what I did. And when I started reporting on Blackwater, it was actually not in Iraq or Afghanistan. I encountered them on the streets of New Orleans in the aftermath of the flooding of the city with Hurricane Katrina. And I'll never forget the first time I saw them there. I was talking to these two New York City police officers who had come down to volunteer in New Orleans, and much of the Louisiana National Guard had been deployed to Iraq. And when they got back, I was there. When they got back, they were livid that they were in Iraq when the point of the National Guard would have been to respond to that, and most of the National Guard was gone. They had been deployed to Iraq, and they got back, and they were cursing Bush when they got off the plane. He's the commander-in-chief, and yet soldiers in uniform were saying "fuck Bush." They were so mad. But what had happened is that because there was this vacuum and all these forces were gone, the Bush administration began hiring mercenary companies that had been working in Iraq and Afghanistan to come down and work for the Department of Homeland Security. Their official job was, to protect FEMA. I don't think FEMA has arrived yet in New Orleans, but the mercenaries were there to guard FEMA on no-bid contracts. So you have these guys walking around. I'm talking to these two New York City police officers, and this compact car pulls up, and these massive men get out of it with M4 assault rifles. They're wearing body armor, wraparound sunglasses, hats with a bear paw logo, Glock 9 strapped to their legs, and they come up, and it was like a mercenary clown car. I couldn't believe how many of them fit into this little Volkswagen Golf. They come up to the police officers and say, where are the rest of the Blackwater guys? And my head starts going, what the fuck did you just say? And the cops say, well, tell them where to go. And I said, Blackwater. They get into their mercenary clown car and drive away. And I said, Blackwater? You mean like the guys in Iraq and Afghanistan? They're like, yeah, they're all over the place. I'm like, what? Because it was like we were there watching people begging for food, local people rescuing their neighbors in boats, and it was just a horrifying post-apocalypse scene. And and these guys are rolling around, listening to death metal and wielding M4 assault rifles. It was just bizarre. And I said, well, where can I find them? He said, you can go either way on the street, meaning they're everywhere. So sure enough, I go down a couple of blocks and watch them tossing the furniture out from this apartment above a bar. I think it was near Bourbon Street, and they're throwing all the furniture out, and then they drape this American flag. And I went up to those guys and just struck up a conversation with them and said, I was in Iraq recently. We were talking about which former Saddam base had now become this company's base or that unit's base, and we knew a couple of people in common, and so some of them had been 82nd Airborne, some of them were former SEALs. One guy there was an Army Ranger, but they're all working for Blackwater. And when I started to ask them, what are you doing here? One of the guys is like, well, we're here to confront criminals and stop looters. And one guy flashes a gold badge from under his vest and says, we were deputized by the governor of the state of Louisiana. And they told me they could use lethal force if they deemed it necessary. And to me, it was sort of, it's like surreal. And if you remember what was going on then, the way that the term looter was being used, you know, I mean, I saw electronic stores untouched next to a 7-Eleven that was completely gutted. And they would find the select image of some yahoo who's carrying a stereo off. But the broader point, you know, about people who had been systematically abandoned, breaking into stores to get diapers and food. And there were so many people that were extrajudicially murdered in New Orleans during that period. And there's probably never going to be justice for all the people that were murdered. But to then throw into that mix people who are not police officers, they're not active duty military, it's not the National Guard, but it's a private for-profit company who, for the first week that they were there, was operating on no government contract. The owner of Blackwater, Eric Prince, just deployed them to an American city armed and on the streets. And on the 8th day they were there, they finally got a no-bid contract from the Department of Homeland Security. But for 1 week, some dude who is a Christian supremacist, who was a major bankroller of the Bush-Cheney campaign and the radical religious right, had sent several hundred of his men onto the streets of an American city with M4 assault rifles, Puma helicopters, to say that they were there to confront criminals and stop looters. When I realized that narrative was true, that I just provided for you, that was the reality, I said, fuck, I want to investigate the hell out of this company. Like, who are these guys and how are they able to do this? And as I started to sort of pull at the string, it's like, you know, if there's an elephant behind a wall, but you're pulling at his tail, and then the wall crumbles, and you see this big elephant ass in front of you. It's like that's the story was on the wall. You think it's something little. And it sort of came to represent everything that was so wrong with that era. It was like Baghdad on the Bayou. All of these companies that had made a killing in Iraq and Afghanistan then sort of transported themselves. They went from the Persian Gulf to the US Gulf. And you had Bechtel and Halliburton and Blackwater and DynCorp and Triple Canopy, and all these companies just started cashing in on the disaster. And you know, a lot of the philosophy behind that was covered in Naomi Klein's fantastic book, The Shock Doctrine, where you sort of understand the historical and economic motivations and strategies that were at play there. So I dug deep into the Blackwater thing, and I worked for The Nation magazine, which is a relatively poor weekly magazine. I mean, it's a great magazine, but it's not a big powerhouse thing, and everyone's always scraping to get by. And I think I'd written like 10 or 15 articles about this one company. And Katrina Vanden Heuvel, the editor of The Nation, sat me down one day and she's like, Jeremy, we love your work and you're doing great stuff, but we are a poor weekly magazine. We can't publish an article every week about the same company. So you have to either like diversify your beat or write a book. And so I wrote a book, and to make a long story short, I went a few months after my book came out. Blackwater operatives gunned down 16 Iraqis in Baghdad's Nisr Square, and this company that had basically existed in relative obscurity, had done contracting for the CIA, for the military special operations forces, for the State Department, DOD. All of a sudden was front page news in a sustained way for months on end, and there were congressional investigations. And so I had never really been on TV much in my life, but once that happened, I was invited to go on all these shows. And what ended up happening is that I started to get emails from guys who were in the special operations community or working with the CIA, who there was a sort of theme to them where they would say, I think you're a pinko who's full of shit, but you're 100% right about these guys. I hate them. And so I got to know a bunch of guys who were basically saying like, I don't like your anti-war shit, but I don't like those guys, and I don't like them more than I don't like you. So they would start talking to me. And at events, guys would come up, and it was interesting, is I always would try to tell people, you have to humanize the other to really test what you believe about whether the U.S. should go to a particular war. Like, what do you actually think? How many of those kids or innocent civilians is an acceptable number killed for you to say, yes, I support a cruise missile strike on this country? But I also was sort of, had a cartoonish version in my head of who people are that are tasked with doing the high-value targeting campaigns or running the drone program or kicking down doors in a night raid. And as funny as it is to think about now, I've actually become friends with several guys who were Navy SEAL snipers, Army Rangers, people who worked in the clandestine division of the CIA, and I've learned a tremendous amount from them. And it was through meeting those people and seeing them as actual humans, going out and having drinks with them and talking to them about non-military stuff, developing a closer relationship with them as friends or closer acquaintances, that they let me into a little bit of the world that they operate in. And so when I first started off on the project that became Dirty Wars, part of what I was doing was chasing leads that some of these guys had given me tips on. And what I wanted to do was to write a book that would tell the story of the men and women who are tasked by the President of the United States with hunting down people that have been designated as enemies of America, to weave their stories in with the stories of civilians and resistance groups in other countries who are either caught in the middle or are fighting against these forces that the United States is sending. And I wanted to paint a human picture of some of the people that we are told are terrorists. And in some cases, you can argue that what they're engaged in is plots for terrorism. In other cases, the United States has intervened in another country's affairs and has conducted operations that have actually strengthened the very forces the US claims to be trying to kill. And at the end of the day, from all of the places that I've been in the last decade plus, I really have come to the conclusion that US policy as it exists right now, where it's kill your way to victory strategy, using drones, night raids, working with warlords and militias, has resulted in a reality where the US is making more new enemies than it is killing actual terrorists. And if that's true, and I think that there's a growing consensus, it's a minority, but I think there's a growing chorus of voices within the special ops and the intelligence community, that many of the actions being taken right now by the US in the name of fighting terrorism or national security are actually undermining national security by making it more likely that new enemies will emerge. And those new enemies may not be terrorists. Those new enemies may be people with a legitimate score to settle. And that should be a pretty sober picture to be looking at as a nation. So with that, I want to wrap up and say that if anyone has questions or comments, or if someone wants to yell at me, I'm happy to hear almost all of it. But yeah, thank you for your time.
That's our program for today. I'm Stanley Heller. This is The Struggle.